Kind introductory words. I'm delighted to be back to speak at the CanCham Crystal Ball Luncheon. I believe it's one of the iconic events on Vietnam's business calendar, so I'm delighted to be here to talk about what's been going on in the regulatory framework over the past 12 months and also going forward. Would probably take a lot longer than 15 minutes. Probably take a lot longer than 15 hours or 15 days, to be quite honest. But what I plan to do is basically focus on those areas of legislation which have changed over the past 12 months or so, which are of widespread interest to everybody, rather than get involved in too many esoteric areas of law. But before we go through that, and I plan to give an economic snapshot. We've heard from the previous couple of speakers, both Don and Nicola, about how the economy has improved over the past 12 months, 2 years, a few years in fact. So I just wanted to sort of touch on that. And then we'll go through the legislation that was passed last year, so some highlights of that legislation, and then what we can expect over the next 12 months with the forthcoming legislation at the National Assembly, which is scheduled for June and November next year. And then I'll give a few conclusions. So if we have a look at these economic indicators, and this is a couple of slides courtesy of CBRE, so thanks very much, Mark and his team. But I think they're excellent. When I got back from the New Year break last week and was preparing for the presentation for this week, the first email that I opened up was from CBRE, and they provided a very good snapshot, I believe, of these economic indicators. And we can see what's happened over the past couple of years, whereby if we looked at 2 years ago, inflation was running at 18%. In fact, I think just over 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, it was running up to 24.1% per annum. And we've seen over the past couple of years, in particular, how that inflation has gone down and how we're down at about 6% per annum, which is obviously very important so far as the manufacturing base in particular in Vietnam and the attractiveness of the manufacturing base in Vietnam is concerned. If you have a look at the FDI figures which have come out for the past year, you'll see that there's been a phenomenal increase in the amount of FDI in manufacturing. And I think that's because Vietnam has shown itself to be a very attractive place for manufacturing. If you look at cost of production, say in Indonesia, last year they did quite a leap for factory workers. If you look at sort of the stability of some of the places in the region, Thailand's obviously looking at a little bit of instability again, unfortunately, for Thailand. Vietnam, over the past 12 months in particular, has proved itself to be a stable environment for investment, for manufacturing in particular, so far as keeping costs of production down. And so we expect that to continue into 2014. We've also seen a lot of investment from Japanese investors. We've seen the Japanese trading houses in Vietnam for quite an extended period of time, but now we're seeing another class of investors from Japan. As part of Abenomics, we've seen sort of a lot of domestic investors from Japan who are now looking overseas for the first time, not only for Vietnam, for investment in Vietnam, but also around the region. So we expect that will continue as well over the next 12 months. If we look at sort of the trade deficit, embarrassing a couple of years ago when Vietnam did have that very high trade deficit of close to $10 billion, and now it's sort of worked through that through various monetary policies, in particular contracting the availability of lending quite drastically. It has to be added a couple of years ago to now, according to the official figures at least, a trade surplus is starting to appear. We also see that the retail and services sector a couple of years ago was very strong. I think partially as the counter-inflationary measures took bite, there was a reduction in the amount of sales turnover in Vietnam on a monthly basis. But you can see that over the past year in particular, there have been increases in the retail and services sector so far as turnover is concerned. If we have a look at sort of the stock exchange index from 2 years ago, it's gone up quite considerably. And in fact, I looked at the paper this morning, and according to the Saigon Times Daily, it's currently at 526. We expect that will continue to climb. Ceteris paribus, everything else being equal as regards to what's going on in the rest of the world, and providing nothing drastic happens on a macro level so far as Vietnam is concerned. But we expect that the stock market will go up further, and that will potentially reach up over 600. So far as the stability of the currency, we've seen that over the past couple of years. I do remember about 3 years ago whereby in the space of a 17-month period, the Vietnam dong devalued by 17%. So we see that that stability over the past couple of years is once again very good for attracting investment, and also in particular so far as keeping inflation down, imported inflation down. If we have a look at the lending rates, I think it was Don mentioned before, they've come down quite considerably from 20% per annum a couple of years ago down to a lot more manageable 13%. And of course this has also led to the deposit rates falling as well. So the cost to businesses of borrowing funds has reduced quite remarkably. It's gone down by a third on average. If we move on to look at the legislation that was passed in 2013, if we see what happened in the first half of 2013, there were various amendments to legislation. The Law on Tax Administration was introduced. There was a Circular 13 on enterprise registration. And there were also new decrees guiding the 2012 Labour Code. And it's probably one of the biggest areas that we've seen such a mountain of legislation is the new Labour Code, which came into force, as you're probably aware, on the 1st of May last year. And with that Labour Code being introduced, there's been these various implementing pieces of legislation, such as the likes of Decree 44 on labour contracts, Decree 45 on working hours. There's another decree on labour disputes, another decree on wages, another decree on labour outsourcing. So it's been quite a busy period for the boys and girls at Melissa, and also the relevant delistas around the place, so far as keeping up with the new labour legislation that's in place. We also saw Circular 8, which was issued. And that's quite relevant so far as the retail sector is concerned. Circular 8 relates to satisfaction of the economic needs test. So foreign retailers are frustrated because essentially they can open one store provided, and they can open a second store provided they can only open that second store or more stores if they satisfy an economic needs test. Probably most people in the room are aware of that. What's happened is that the government has finally last year, with Circular 8, introduced a framework for at least providing the ability for foreigners to open retail outlets of less than 500 square meters in a size and in an area where the local authority has approved the plan for the activities of distribution and retail. And the economic needs test, according to that circular, will be based on the district area rather than the provincial area. There's various procedures and detailed criteria for conducting the economic needs test, and unfortunately they are still unclear. And in the Saigon Times Daily this morning, the Vice Chairman of the Ho Chi Minh City People's Committee, Lei Man Ha, stated that there were still unnecessary procedures in circular rate, and the People's Committee of Ho Chi Minh City would submit an official proposal to the Ministry of Industry and Trade to try and reduce the unnecessary administrative burdens so far as being able to satisfy the economic needs test. So that's very welcome news for the People's Committee of Ho Chi Minh City to come out and say that, and I think we will see further investment from foreign investors into the retail sector. Obviously, the stores are relatively small, so we're talking about 500 square meters or less. Good for a boutique, probably good for a small supermarket, but not good for a mega market like a Tesco's or what have you. But it's quite positive in that it's a step forward. And as we know from experience in Vietnam, when you get these steps forward, there's an opportunity to further advance the relevant legislation later on. So at the moment it's less than 500 square meters. Hopefully in the future it will be more. There was also an amended ordinance on foreign exchange controls, which confirms that there will be no denomination of prices in foreign currency, and retains the current requirement that foreign investors must set up a direct investment account. So far as landlords are concerned, when you're negotiating your lease with your landlord, make sure you point out this particular piece of legislation and show them the amended ordinance on foreign exchange controls. First up, it would be illegal to have a lease contract which is denominated in US dollars. It must be in Vietnam dong. Secondly, questionable as regards to any hedging arrangements that they might be providing in that lease contract. So if there's an enterprise doing business in Vietnam, if your income is from Vietnam dong, from a matching perspective, you want to make sure that your outgoings are also related to Vietnam dong. So bear that one in mind when you're next negotiating your lease contract. If we say, look at, there was a new Decree 55 on labour outsourcing. There's also the other major area, apart from labour legislation last year, was also in relation to corporate income tax amendments and amendments to the value-added tax regime. We saw in the second half of 2013 there was an amended constitution which created a lot of discussion, but it's still, Article 2 of the Constitution still says government shall be for the people, by the people, and of the people. So a straight lift from Thomas Jefferson back in the 18th century. Probably more relevant, previously, it wasn't enshrined in the law, and sometimes it was difficult to get that approval from the relevant licensing authority. It's also, of course, possible to both, for such foreign investors to do both, foreign investor enterprises to now do both sale and leasing of apartment buildings. A cautionary note though, and that is there's the ability under the new landlord for the government to withdraw land if the investment projects have not been implemented within a 12-month period or still stagnant after 2 years of receiving the land. There's an amended law on enterprises which talks about, among other things, re-registration of foreign invested enterprises. We went through this process back in 2006. There's been a number of foreign invested enterprises which did not re-register during the relevant time period. For those foreign invested enterprises whereby their term has lapsed, they have until, I think it's the 11th of February, to basically, or the middle of next month, to make sure that they re-register under the law on enterprises. There's not a requirement to re-register if the term of your investment certificate has not lapsed. Right. One of the more interesting pieces of legislation that came out was Circular 24, which was issued by the Ministry of Education and Training, which talked about the ability of Vietnam heroic mothers and revolutionary activists who were revolutionary activists before 1945 and the mothers of those revolutionary activists who were activists before 1945, they would get bonus marks if they sat university exams. So someone, I think, cottoned on rather quickly that if you're a mother of a revolutionary activist who was a revolutionary activist for 1945, you'd obviously done a very good job, but you're probably at least 100 years old. So this circular came out, and then a couple of weeks later it was repealed. But you can obviously see that there's quite a lot of happy, heroic mothers who are sitting there. Just briefly, there's amended constitution coming into force from the 1st January. There's new law on science has been increased from 4 months to 6 months. With regards to the highlights for the laws to be passed in next year, we see that there's a law on immigration that's due to be passed in June, construction law, environmental protection law, customs law, bankruptcy law, which has been under much discussion. It's the third bankruptcy law that's been introduced since I've been in Vietnam. Hopefully this one will be much better than the previous two, whereby it made it very difficult to make a company bankrupt. The first one between 1994 and 2004, there were only about 50 companies that were made bankrupt under that law in the whole country. So we're hopeful that the new bankruptcy law will provide greater teeth to make companies bankrupt. There's going to be an amended law on medical insurance, amended law on marriage, law on internal waterway transportation, social insurance, residential houses, real estate. There'll be a new law on enterprise, a new law on investment. Some of these law changes are as a result of laws that were introduced during the time of WTO commitments and leading up to WTO commitments. So if we say take the law on residential houses, law on real estate, law on enterprise and law on investment, they were appropriate for Vietnam back in 2005, 2006, leading up to Vietnam's WTO accession in early 2007, but now they've been overhauled because I think through trial and error and practices, people have realized that there needs to be some further amendments to those particular provisions, and as Vietnam advances, then so will the sophistication and the development of the likes of corporate governance under the new law on enterprises and also the law on investment. There'll be also a law on enforcement of civil judgments, which we eagerly await, a law on pharmaceuticals and special consumption tax. Later on in the year, we're going to see a new civil code, which will be discussed. These are only laws which will be discussed in the second session of the National Assembly, which is held in November, December next year. So there'll be a new civil code discussed, new law on labour safety, new law on natural resources, seas and islands, and amended law on accounting. Just a few conclusions. As I mentioned, there's going to be next year a series of laws which are passed basically to reflect current circumstances rather than the situation at the time of WTO accession. It's not to say that any of the commitments under WTO accession are going to be repealed, because they'll still need to be there in the law, but I think there'll be some further improvements to the legislation, which I think a lot of lawyers around Vietnam would be very welcome to see. There will be CIT tax reductions, which will be used to fight against the economic downturn. We've seen that already. There's various percentages and changes to those percentages depending upon the amount of income. So the CIT rate will reduce from 25% down to 22% from 2014, and will be further reduced down to 20% from 2016. If you are an enterprise in which your revenue is less than 20 billion dong per annum, i.e. $1 million per annum, then you'll get the lower CIT rate of 20% effective from this year. There's also a broadening of CIT incentives under the amended law on CIT, and deductible expenses have increased as well. So the likes of advertising and promotion expenses, the cap has been increased from 10% to 15%. So that's come a long way. Okay, Graham's given me the hard word, but essentially just to finalise, I mean, a few thoughts about 2014. I see it's going to be a very positive year. I picked that the Vietnamese economy turned around in July last year. I think that's going to happen for 2014 as well. We will see more Japanese investment into Vietnam as a result of lower cost of production in Vietnam as compared to, say, China and elsewhere in the region. Um, I think, when we look at sort of the other benefits for the next 12 months, if TPP signs during the course of 2014, I think overall that will be fantastic for Vietnam and will provide a great fillip for the economy, further manufacturing exports out of here. Um, ASEAN 2015 is obviously just around the corner as well. And as I mentioned before, I think the stock market is going to do very well this year. Well, that's what Don's driver told me anyway.